That morning, before any of it started, Olivia sat on the edge of the bathtub with her phone pressed to her ear, listening to a billing clerk read numbers off a screen in a voice trained not to sound like bad news even when it was. $14,200. That was the balance left after insurance, after the payment plan, after the $400 Olivia sent every month like a tide that never quite reached the shore it was aimed at. "I can do $600 this month," she told the clerk. "I know it's not much. Any amount helps, Mrs. Hale." The clerk paused. "I have you listed under Bennett here. Is that right, or should I update the file?" "Bennett's fine." It always came out faster than she meant it to. She wasn't ashamed of her married name. She just wasn't ready yet to let it touch the parts of her life that still belonged to her sister. The version of herself that existed before lawyers and paperwork, and a ring she still sometimes forgot to wear until she was halfway out the door. She hung up and sat there a moment longer, the tile cold under her bare feet, and told herself the same thing she always told herself after these calls. She would find a way to close the gap herself. She didn't need to ask Daniel for it. Asking Daniel for it would mean explaining why she hadn't asked 8 months ago. And every version of that conversation she'd practiced in her head ended the same way, with him looking at her like she was something fragile he'd married by accident. Down the hall, she heard him on his own call, low and clipped, the tone he used for work and only for work. She caught fragments through the door. Something about a position, something about a family trust, something about timing that needed to hold until spring. She didn't try to hear more than that. Whatever it wasn't hers to ask about. The same way her sister's hospital bill wasn't his to know about. They'd built the marriage on separate rooms like that, she realized, standing in front of the mirror an hour later, zipping a dress she couldn't quite reach the back of. Separate rooms with a shared address. Need a hand. Daniel appeared in the doorway, tie hanging loose around his collar, and crossed the room before she answered, his fingers finding the zipper without being asked. He did up the last 3 inches slowly, like it wasn't nothing. "Thanks." She met his eyes in the mirror. "You're distracted. Work thing. Nothing that can't wait." He held her gaze a beat longer than the sentence needed. "You're distracted too. Just tired." He didn't push it, and she was grateful for that in the moment. The way you're grateful for a door left unlocked. Without noticing, it means someone trusted you to walk through it eventually. Neither of them did. They finished dressing in a comfortable quiet that had taken months to build, and would take considerably less time to break. The ballroom at the Ashford held 200 guests that night, and Olivia Bennett knew at least half of them by reputation before she ever learned their faces. Charity Gellis ran on the same current every time. Champagne poured a little too fast. Laughter pitched a little too loud. Somewhere under the chandeliers, 100 conversations circling the same 3 subjects: money, marriage, and who had lost either one recently. She smoothed the front of her dress in the hotel's mirrored hallway and told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself since the invitation arrived 3 weeks ago. 8 months married. She still hadn't gotten used to saying that out loud, let alone believing it belonged to her. It had started as paperwork. Technically, a foundation her late father had helped build needed a controlling partner willing to keep it running the way he'd intended. And Daniel Hale's family had money tangled up in it from decades back, long before either of them were born. The lawyers called it a strategic marriage. Olivia's grandmother, on the one visit she made before she passed, had simply called it convenient, and left it at that. Nobody in the family had asked Olivia whether convenient was a word she wanted attached to her life. She'd said yes anyway, because saying yes meant her sister's medical bills stopped following her into her sleep. And because Daniel, sitting across from her in a lawyer's office with his sleeves rolled up and his tie already loosened, had looked at her like she was a person and not a line item. That had been enough, once. Some nights it still was. Daniel stood a few feet away now, checking something on his phone, his jaw doing that thing it did when work followed him into a room he didn't want it in. He wore the tux like it belonged to him and not the other way around, which was the first thing she'd noticed about him back when they were still strangers signing paperwork, instead of people who shared a bed and, more often than either of them said out loud, an actual conversation. "You don't have to come in with me," she said. "I can find the table on my own." "I know you can." He put the phone away. "Doesn't mean I want you to." It was the kind of answer that should have settled something in her chest, and mostly did, except for the small stubborn part of her that still flinched at kindness she hadn't asked for. She'd grown up learning to want less so she'd need less, and 8 months of a husband who noticed things hadn't undone 11 years of that particular habit yet. Her mother had taught her that lesson without meaning to, working 2 jobs and apologizing for neither of them. And Olivia had absorbed it the way children absorb everything that isn't explained to them directly. They walked in together. Heads turned, the way heads always turn for Daniel Hale. Though half the room still couldn't have told you what his company actually did, only that it did it quietly and did it well. Olivia had learned early in the marriage that the loudest money in Manhattan wasn't always the richest. Daniel's family kept their name off buildings on purpose, kept interviews short, kept photographs rare enough that most of the city recognized his face from 3 or 4 events a year and nothing more. It made him easy to underestimate. She suspected that was the point. A waiter offered her a glass she didn't take. Across the room, near the string quartet, a woman in emerald green watched her with the specific attention of someone deciding whether to walk over. "Friend of yours?" Daniel asked, following her gaze. Not exactly. Olivia recognized the dress before she recognized the face underneath it. And once she did, her stomach dropped in a way she chose not to explain. Victoria Shaw. She used to run in the same circles as someone I used to date. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. Used to. It was a long time ago. How long? Long enough that I shouldn't still be able to spot her from across a ballroom, Olivia said. And the joke came out thinner than she meant it to. She hadn't told him much about Ryan. Not because there was some great secret buried there, but because the story embarrassed her more than it hurt her. And she'd rather Daniel think of her as someone who'd never needed rescuing than as the girl who'd once mistaken control for love. 3 years with Ryan Cross had taught her to apologize for things that weren't her fault, and to make herself smaller in rooms exactly like this one. He used to critique her outfits before parties, always gently, always framed as helping her, until she stopped trusting her own taste in anything. She didn't want her husband to meet that version of her. She barely wanted to remember it herself. For the first hour, the party behaved itself. Daniel got pulled into a conversation with 2 board members from a foundation he funded. The kind of conversation where men in good suits nodded at each other over numbers Olivia only half followed, and she drifted toward the dessert table, where she could watch the room without being watched back. Across the space, Victoria Shaw had drifted too, close enough now that Olivia could hear fragments of her voice, low and warm, talking to a man Olivia didn't immediately place. It was Ryan's laugh that placed him for her, half a second before she turned. "They still haven't figured out how to make these taste like anything," he said, appearing at her elbow like he'd been waiting for the exact moment she was alone. "You'd think for what these tickets cost." She turned around because there wasn't a version of this where she didn't. Ryan Cross looked the way he always looked, expensive and pleased with himself, a drink already half gone in his hand. 2 years hadn't touched him. Maybe money didn't let it. "Ryan," she kept her voice level. "I didn't know you'd be here. I didn't know you'd be married." He smiled like it was a joke between old friends instead of a blade with the handle still warm. "Congratulations. By the way, I read about it." Small notice, tucked way back in the paper. "Almost missed it. We wanted it quiet." "I bet you did." His eyes went past her, toward Daniel, still deep in conversation 20 feet away. "He know about the gallery, by the way. The one that folded. The $11,000 you still owe your old landlord in Bushwick." Something in her went very still, the way a house goes still right before a storm reaches it. "That's not really your business anymore." "No," he agreed easily. "But it's kind of a fun story, don't you think? Girl loses her gallery. Girl loses her apartment. Girl marries the richest guy in the room 8 months later. People are going to ask questions eventually. Might as well get ahead of it." "Is that a threat?" "It's an observation." He finished his drink and set the glass down on the table beside her, close enough that she had to step back. "I just think it's funny. You used to tell me you'd never let money decide anything for you. Very principled. Very above it all." He tilted his head. "Guess that lasted until the right number showed up." A woman nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Olivia felt the shape of the room shifting around her, other conversations slowing, other eyes finding their way over. The particular gravity that formed whenever a scene started building itself in public. She wanted to walk away. She also knew that walking away from Ryan Cross had never once made him stop, only made him louder. And there were now enough people close enough to hear him get louder. "I think you should go find your own table," she said. "I think you should tell your husband the truth before somebody else does it for him." Ryan's voice climbed just slightly. Pitched for an audience now instead of for her. Actually, you know what? Let's just settle this. Everyone loves a good story. He raised his glass toward the center of the room, and for one terrible second Olivia understood exactly what he was about to do. The way you understand a glass is about to fall a half beat before it leaves the table. Too late to catch it. Too late to do anything but watch. A toast, Ryan announced, loud enough to pull separate conversations to a stop. To old flames and new fortunes. To Olivia Bennett, who once told me she'd rather starve than marry for money, and somehow found a way to do both at the same time. Laughter rippled out from somewhere, uncertain, the kind that didn't know yet whether it was allowed. Somewhere behind Ryan, half hidden by a marble column, Victoria Shaw watched with her lips pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile. One hand curled around her phone like she was waiting for a signal to type something into it. Olivia didn't see that part. She was too busy feeling her own face go hot and her hands go cold, and she did not reach for either explanation, because there wasn't a clean one to reach for, not one that would survive a room like this. She stood very straight instead, chin level, the only defense she had ever really owned. That's enough, she said quieter than she wanted it to be. I'm just saying congratulations. Ryan spread his hands, all innocence, playing to the small crowd that had gathered now without quite meaning to. Hell, if I had a foundation account I could marry into, I probably wouldn't have principles either. Ryan. What? I'm not wrong, am I? Ask her landlord. Ask the bank that took the gallery. Ask. Ask me, Daniel said. Olivia hadn't heard him cross the room. He was simply there, suddenly at her side and half a step in front of her, and the shift in the air around them was immediate. The particular silence that fell when a man used to being the loudest thing in a building recognized that he wasn't. Not tonight, not here. Ryan's smile didn't drop right away. It just slowed down, like something running out of momentum. Daniel Hale. Ryan recovered fast. Extended a hand Daniel didn't take. Good to finally meet you. I was just saying. I heard what you were saying. Daniel's voice stayed even, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. You run money at Cross Capital. Is that right? That's right. Something flickered behind Ryan's eyes. A small recalibration. You know the fund. I know it well. Daniel let the pause sit there long enough to mean something. Better than you'd think, actually. Across the room, a man in his 60s who'd been laughing with a group near the bar stopped laughing. Olivia watched it happen without understanding it yet. The way the older man's face went carefully blank. The way he set his drink down and started moving toward them with the particular urgency of someone who just remembered an appointment he couldn't afford to miss. Marcus Daniel nodded at the older man as he arrived, still not looking away from Ryan. You should probably hear this too. It concerns one of your fund managers. Daniel, Marcus's voice had gone thin. I didn't realize you were. We can talk logistics tomorrow. Daniel's tone didn't change, but something underneath it had. A coldness moving through warm water. Tonight I just want your associate here to understand something, since he seems confused about who he's talking to. Ryan's jaw tightened. Around them, the small crowd had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight to it, that people lean into instead of away from. You stood in front of my wife, Daniel said, at a party neither of us needed to attend, and decided the best use of your evening was making her past sound like a crime. I don't know what happened between the two of you, and frankly, I don't care enough to ask. But I do know Cross Capital took on new capital 11 months ago. I know exactly whose capital it was. He let that land. And I know a call I make tomorrow morning is going to be a lot more interesting for you than anything you said here tonight. That's you can't just. Ryan looked at Marcus, who was very carefully not looking at anyone. Marcus, tell him this is. I think you should apologize to Mrs. Hale, Marcus said quietly. And then I think you should leave. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick enough that Olivia could feel 200 people deciding all at once not to look directly at any of them. Ryan opened his mouth once, closed it, and for the first time in the 2 years, she'd known him to speak in that particular tone, the one built for winning. He didn't have anything to say back. He left without the apology. Marcus went after him, already talking low and fast, already doing damage control for a fire he hadn't started. Victoria lingered a moment longer than either of them, her eyes finding Daniel's face and holding there for one beat too long before she turned and slipped toward the terrace doors, her phone already lit up in her hand. Daniel didn't watch any of them go. He turned to Olivia instead, and whatever had been cold in his face a moment ago wasn't there anymore. Just something quieter and more careful, like he was checking a door he'd shut too hard. You okay? I don't know yet. It was the truest thing she could offer him. You didn't have to do that. I know, he didn't apologize for it, and she found she didn't want him to. I wanted to. Across the ballroom, near the tall windows overlooking the park, a woman in her 70s sat alone at a table set for six, a glass of wine untouched in front of her, watching the entire scene resolve itself with an expression that gave away nothing at all. She had not moved during the worst of it. She had not needed to. Her phone buzzed once against the tablecloth, and she glanced down at whatever Victoria had just sent her, then set the phone face down again and folded her hands. Unbothered, patient. The way people are patient when a plan they've been building has just cleared its first real test, and there are still several more to go. Olivia didn't see her. She was too busy trying to breathe normally again. Too busy noticing that Daniel's hand had found the small of her back without either of them deciding it should. Too busy wondering exactly how her husband had known the size and timing of a stranger's investment down to the month. 11 months, she said finally, once they'd found a quiet corner near the terrace doors, away from the worst of the noise. You said Cross Capital took new capital 11 months ago. That's specific for someone who claims he doesn't follow hedge funds for fun. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something behind it went careful. I follow where our family's money goes. That's all. That's all, she repeated. So the Hale family has money in Ryan's fund. Had, he said. We adjusted the position a few months back. Why? Because I don't like the way he does business. He said it simply. Like that closed the subject. And for tonight, exhausted and still shaking faintly in a way she refused to name, she let it. Some part of her noted, quietly, that 11 months put the timing well before she and Daniel had even met, and she filed that thought away without knowing yet what to do with it. You never mentioned knowing him, she added instead. I didn't know him. I knew about him. Daniel's eyes stayed steady on hers. There's a difference. Is there? Tonight, there is. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. Though some part of her kept turning the timeline over like a coin she couldn't decide the value of. Her phone buzzed in her clutch before she could ask anything else. An unknown number. A text with no name attached. 3 lines that made the noise of the party fall away from her entirely. Your sister's hospital called. There's a payment on the account they can't explain. They said to ask you before they process anything further. Olivia read it twice, then a third time, and felt the ground under the whole evening tilt just slightly. The way floors do right before you understand you're standing somewhere you didn't think you were. She hadn't made a payment. She hadn't had enough left over to make one in months, which was the entire reason her sister's account had a balance in the first place. A fact she had never once said out loud to the man now watching her face with open concern. What is it? Daniel asked. She looked up at her husband, at the man who apparently knew the exact month a stranger's hedge fund took on new money, who had walked into a public humiliation and dismantled it in under 90 seconds, who had never once, in 8 months of marriage, explained where all of his knowledge actually came from, and who was looking at her now like the answer to her question mattered more than anything else happening in the room. Nothing, she said, and hated how easily the lie came out, how much it sounded like his. I'll tell you later. She put the phone away. Across the room, Victoria Shaw had already found her way to the older woman by the windows, bending down to murmur something close to her ear, and neither of them noticed Olivia watching. Or if they did, neither of them showed it. The older woman listened without turning her head, then reached up and patted Victoria's hand once. Twice the gesture of someone confirming a plan was still exactly on schedule. They left 20 minutes later, Daniel's hand steady against the small of her back all the way to the car. And neither of them said much until the city lights started sliding past the window in long orange streaks. You're quiet, Daniel said. So are you, I asked first. She almost smiled. Almost. I keep thinking about the 11 months. Olivia, you don't have to explain it tonight. She turned to look at him. And in the low light of the back seat, his face looked older than it had in the ballroom. Tired in a way he usually hid better. I just want to understand what I married. Not the name on the building. The actual person. You married the person who showed up every night for 8 months, he said. That part was never a performance. Then why does it feel like there's a whole file on you I haven't been given access to? He didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that she thought he might let it stand, the way he let so many things stand instead of explaining them. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter, less armored. There's things about my family I don't talk about, because talking about them doesn't change them, he said. My grandmother built half of what we have out of decisions I wouldn't have made. I spend a lot of my life trying to fix the parts of it that still need fixing. Quietly, before anyone notices there was a problem in the first place. That's not a secret from you specifically. It's just not a story I tell at parties. I'm not a party, Daniel. No, he reached over and took her hand. And this time, she let herself feel the weight of it instead of just noting it. You're not. It wasn't an answer. She knew it wasn't an answer, even as she let it sit there between them. Unpushed, because pushing tonight would have meant admitting she was keeping a file of her own. One with a hospital's phone number in it and a payment neither of them had made. She watched the buildings go by instead and thought about her sister's voice on the phone last week. Thin and apologetic, telling her not to worry about the money. Please, she'd figure something out. Olivia hadn't believed her then either. Across town, in a townhouse on a street quiet enough that the traffic never reached it, Eleanor Hale sat alone in a study that had belonged to her husband before it belonged to her. A glass untouched sherry sweating a ring onto the desk in front of her. She'd taken off her jewelry piece by piece the moment she got home, the way she always did, as if the weight of it only became bearable once nobody was left to see her carry it. Victoria's message still sat open on her phone. Handled. He stepped in exactly like you said he would. She read it twice and felt nothing that resembled triumph, which surprised her more than it should have after 73 years of getting exactly what she planned for. She had wanted proof. That was all. Proof that her grandson still moved like his grandfather used to. Decisive and a little reckless when someone he loved was threatened. The kind of man who forgot to protect himself while he was busy protecting everyone else. She had gotten her proof tonight. She should have felt satisfied. Instead, she found herself thinking of Olivia's face in the second before Daniel arrived. That particular stillness of a woman deciding not to give a room the satisfaction of watching her break. Eleanor had worn that same stillness once, a long time ago, at a dinner table full of men who thought a widow with a company was a widow who'd sell it. She hadn't sold it. She'd buried two of them in business instead, quietly the way she did everything, and never once needed anyone to step in on her behalf. She picked up the phone, typed 3 words back to Victoria Good, keep watching, and then sat for a long moment with her thumb hovering over send, before she finally pressed it and set the phone face down. The same gesture she'd made in the ballroom 2 hours earlier, though this time nobody was there to see whether her hand was as steady as it looked. Olivia didn't know the old woman's name yet. She didn't know Victoria's texts were arriving in that quiet townhouse in real time, or that the gala had been less an accident of overlapping guest lists than an invitation extended with a specific outcome in mind. She only knew that her phone held an unexplained hospital payment, that her husband held a knowledge of hedge funds he hadn't earned by accident, and that somewhere underneath both of those facts was a version of the truth nobody in her life had offered her yet. She would learn it soon enough. Tonight had barely been the opening move. Upstairs later, she lay awake beside a husband who slept like a man with nothing left to guard, and stared at the ceiling until the numbers stopped moving behind her eyes. $14,200. 11 months. A stranger's payment on her sister's account, made by no one she could name. Somewhere in the gap between those 3 facts sat an answer she wasn't ready for, and she fell asleep before she found it. The phone still warm on the nightstand where she'd left it. Screen dark, waiting. Olivia called the hospital's billing office 3 separate times over the next 2 days before anyone would tell her anything at all. And even then what they told her only opened up more questions than it closed. There was a standing account attached to her sister's file, set up through a payment service the hospital used for what they called sponsored care. The clerk on the 3rd call, younger than the others and less careful with her words, mentioned in passing that the account had been active for a little over 2 years before catching herself and going quiet. 2 years. Olivia sat with that number long after she'd hung up the phone. She and Daniel had met 20 months ago, in a lawyer's office, over paperwork neither of them had wanted to need. 2 years put the account 4 months before that meeting, before she had any idea Daniel Hale existed outside of the occasional headline about a foundation gala or a building sale. She told herself there had to be an explanation that didn't unravel the story she'd been telling herself about her own life. Some coincidence involving her father's old foundation contacts. Some distant relative she'd forgotten about. She almost believed it by the time Daniel came home that night, tie already loosened, looking for all the world like a man with nothing on his mind but dinner. "Good day," he asked, dropping his bag by the door the way he always did, the one small mess he allowed himself in an otherwise ordered life. "Fine." She watched him cross to the kitchen, watched him move through their apartment with the easy familiarity of someone who'd never once had to wonder if he belonged somewhere. Quiet, actually. Quiet's good. He found her eyes and held them a second too long, like he was checking a weather report before deciding what to wear outside. You'd tell me if it wasn't. Of course, she said, and the lie sat on her tongue the way it had at the party. Easy and practiced, and nothing at all like the truth. She didn't push it that night. She told herself she needed more before she asked him anything, because she knew by now that Daniel didn't hand over information. He confirmed it. And confirming things required already knowing most of the shape of them. Across the city, Ryan Cross was learning a different kind of lesson. Marcus called him into the glass office on the 41st floor at 9 in the morning. And by 9:15, Ryan understood that the version of his career he'd built over the last 6 years had a hole in it he hadn't noticed until someone else pointed a flashlight straight through the middle. The Hale family pulled their remaining position this morning, Marcus said, not looking up from the folder in front of him. Wire cleared an hour ago. That's 40% of our largest single account, Ryan. 40%. Gone before the market even opened. That's not Marcus. That's not just about me. Isn't it? Marcus finally looked up. Daniel Hale doesn't do public. You know that. He does the opposite of public. On principle. Always has. And last night he stood in the middle of a ballroom and made a scene specifically about you. He closed the folder. I've got investors calling, asking why the man who funds a third of our book just torched one of our managers in front of 200 people. I don't have an answer for them. That doesn't end with your name in it. So what? I'm just done. Over some ex I dated 3 years ago. You're on leave while the LPs decide if they still trust this fund, Marcus said. Whether you're done is a question for next month, not for me. Ryan left the building without going back to his desk. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before he called the only person who'd told him the party would work out fine. The one who'd promised him this exact conversation with Marcus wouldn't happen. The one whose name he still had saved in his phone under a single letter. You said he wouldn't make it a work problem, Ryan said. The second Victoria picked up. You said this was a marriage thing, a personal thing, that it wouldn't touch the fund. I said it would rattle him. Victoria's voice stayed even, the practiced calm of someone used to managing men who were panicking. I didn't promise you the outcome, Ryan. I promised you it would happen. 40% of our book just left, Victoria. 40%. Then it worked better than we thought it would. A pause, careful. Measuring. You'll be fine. Eleanor doesn't forget people who do what she asks. Eleanor doesn't sign my paycheck. No, Victoria agreed. But she signs quite a lot of other people's. And she's very good at making sure the right people remember who helped her when it mattered. Another pause. Sit tight. Don't do anything that makes this worse. What did she even want from this? Walk me through it again. Because from where I'm sitting, I torched my own career so an old woman could watch her grandson play hero at a party. She wanted proof, Victoria said. Quieter now. That's all I know. And, honestly, that's more than you need to know. Proof of what? That's not my information to give you. The line went quiet for a second. And when Victoria spoke again, something in her tone had shifted, careful in a different way than before. Go home, Ryan. Have a drink. This isn't the kind of fire you put out by asking more questions tonight. She hung up before he could argue. And Ryan sat in the dark of the parking garage a long time after the call ended, turning something over that felt uncomfortably close to realizing he'd been a tool the whole time and not a participant. He'd walked into that ballroom thinking he was settling an old score on his own terms, evening out something that had bruised his pride since Olivia walked out on him 2 years ago without so much as a real fight about it. It was starting to look like somebody else had picked the target, loaded the gun, and simply handed it to him at exactly the right moment, and let him believe the aim had been his own idea. He didn't call Victoria back that night. He sat instead with his laptop open on the kitchen counter of an apartment his fund manager's salary had bought him. And for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, he started looking for information instead of using it. He pulled up old internal records first, the kind every analyst at Cross Capital had access to but almost nobody actually read. Going back through the fund's investor history, looking for the Hale family's original entry point. 11 months, Daniel had said. Ryan found the wire instead at 14 months, then traced it backward through 3 shell entities before he found what he was actually looking for. Buried in a compliance filing nobody outside the back office ever opened, a name from 4 years earlier. attached to a foundation that had lost its primary funding line in the same fiscal quarter its director had died. William Bennett. Olivia's father. Ryan sat back from the screen slower than he meant to, and read the filing a second time to make sure he hadn't imagined the name sitting where it had no business sitting, in a ledger that traced straight back to a decision made by Hale Group 4 years before he'd ever heard the word Ashford or the name Eleanor. He didn't sleep much that night, and not because of the leave, or the LPs, or Marcus, or any of the things he'd spent the drive home telling himself he was worried about. 3 days after the gala, a car came for Olivia and Daniel at 6 in the evening, sent by a woman Olivia had heard mentioned exactly twice in 8 months of marriage and met exactly never. Daniel's grandmother did not attend most family events in person anymore, according to him, preferring to run the family from a townhouse on a street quiet enough that the traffic never reached it. Tonight, apparently, was an exception. She wants to meet you properly, Daniel said in the car, his hand resting on Olivia's knee in a way that felt more like bracing than affection. She's not what you're picturing. I'm not picturing anything. I don't have enough information to picture anything. Good, he said. Keep it that way. Whatever she says tonight, don't take it personally. She tests people. It's not about you specifically. Everything about tonight is about me specifically, Daniel. She's meeting your wife for the first time, 8 months after the wedding. He didn't have an answer for that, and the rest of the ride passed in the kind of silence that isn't peace so much as a held breath. Eleanor Hale received them in a sitting room with a fire lit despite the mild evening. Seated in a chair positioned so that anyone speaking to her had to face the light and let her keep her own face half in shadow. She was smaller than Olivia expected, and somehow that made her more unsettling instead of less. The way a quiet room can hold more danger than a loud one. So this is the wife, Eleanor said, setting down a teacup without looking at it, her eyes doing a slow, unhurried pass over Olivia that took in the dress, the shoes, the way she stood. You're smaller in person than the photograph suggested. I get that a lot, Olivia said. Something flickered at the corner of Eleanor's mouth. Not quite a smile. Sit. Both of you. I don't bite. Whatever Daniel's told you. He hasn't told me anything, Olivia said, sitting across from her. That seems to be a family trait. The flicker widened, just slightly, into something that might have been approval. Good. At least you noticed. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Daniel. I heard about the gala. Very dramatic. Very unlike you. You heard about it fast, Daniel said, his voice carefully flat. Considering you weren't there. I have people everywhere, darling. You know that. Eleanor turned back to Olivia before Daniel could push further. Tell me about your father. William Bennett. I met him once, years ago, at a fundraiser neither of us wanted to attend. Olivia's stomach tightened at the sound of her father's full name in this woman's mouth. Delivered so casually it took her a second to feel the weight of it. He passed 4 years ago. I know. I read the notice. Eleanor's expression didn't shift, but something in her posture did. A stillness that hadn't been there a moment before. He ran a small foundation. Arts funding. Education grants. That sort of thing. Modest, but well-regarded. You knew him, Olivia said slowly. You said you met him once. Once, Eleanor repeated. A long time ago. Business circles overlap more than people think, especially in this city. She reached for her tea again. And this time, her hand wasn't quite as steady as it had been a moment before. A detail so small Olivia almost missed. It's a shame. What happened to his foundation's funding? Near the end. Timing is a cruel thing sometimes. What do you mean? What happened to it? Nothing worth dredging up tonight. Eleanor set the tea down without drinking it and folded her hands in her lap. And whatever door had cracked open a moment ago closed again. Smooth and total. Like it had never been open at all. I only meant that I understand loss. We have that much in common. You and I. Daniel shifted beside Olivia, and when she glanced at him, his jaw had gone tight in a way she recognized from the party. The look of a man recalculating something in real time. Grandmother, we should get to why you asked us here. Straight to business then. Fine, Eleanor's attention swung back to Olivia. Sharper now, all business. I want to know if you intend to stay married to my grandson, Mrs. Hale, or if you're simply waiting out whatever arrangement got you here in the first place. That's not a fair question, Daniel said. I didn't ask you. Eleanor didn't look away from Olivia. Well, Olivia held the old woman's gaze and felt, for the first time all evening, Something steady settled into her chest instead of fear. I intend to stay married to your grandson because I chose to, not because a contract told me to. If that's not the answer you were hoping for, I can't help that. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing at all. Then, slowly, she nodded once and reached for her tea a third time, her hand fully steady now. That's the first honest thing anyone said in this room tonight. She took a sip. We'll see how long it lasts. They left 40 minutes later, the goodbyes brisk and formal. Eleanor's housekeeper seeing them to the door while Eleanor herself stayed by the fire, claiming her knees didn't do well with stairs and hallways after dark. She waited until she heard the car pull away from the curb before she let her shoulders drop. An inch, maybe less. The kind of surrender nobody would have caught if they'd still been in the room to see it. She sat alone by the fire a long while after that, the tea gone cold beside her, and found herself thinking of William Bennett in a way she hadn't let herself think of him in years. Not the fundraiser story she'd told Olivia, but the other one, the one she kept in a drawer of her own mind that she opened as rarely as possible. A quarterly board call. A vote she hadn't fought hard enough against. A foundation's funding line. Gone in a single afternoon over a dispute that had nothing to do with William Bennett at all and everything to do with the decision her husband made and asked her to sign off on without asking her to look too closely at the reasons why. She had signed it. She had told herself, at the time, that it was business, that everyone survived business, that a man like William Bennett would find another way. She had been wrong about that, and she had known she was wrong about it within a year, once it was far too late to matter to anyone but her own conscience. She picked up her phone and looked at Victoria's earlier message again. Handled. He stepped in exactly like you said he would. It should have felt like closing a loop she'd been trying to close for years. Instead, it felt like watching the same mistake happen a second time, in slow motion, with better manners. She did not call anyone that night. She sat by the fire until it burned down to almost nothing, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Hale let herself feel the full weight of not knowing anymore, whether the thing she'd built to atone for an old mistake was fixing anything at all, or simply repeating its shape in a new generation. The next morning, Olivia drove out to Bushwick on her own, without telling Daniel where she was going, and stood in front of the gallery space that used to be hers, now a plant shop with hand-lettered signage and a bell over the door. Her old landlord still owned the building next door, and he remembered her the second she walked in. The way people remember tenants who left owing money and then, mysteriously, stopped owing it. Your balance cleared out about 8 months back, he told her, wiping his hands on his apron, clearly relieved to finally get to say this to her face instead of to a lawyer's letterhead. Lawyer came by with a cashier's check, said it was on behalf of a client who wished to remain anonymous. I figured you knew. Figured maybe a relative finally came through. Do you still have the lawyer's name? He did, written on the back of an old invoice he'd kept out of habit, a firm Olivia didn't recognize. 3 names long. The kind of firm that existed specifically to keep other people's names out of paperwork. She sat in her car outside the plant shop for 20 minutes, and then, instead of driving straight home, she called her sister. Hey, stranger. Grace's voice came through tired but warm, the way it always did lately. Worn thin at the edges by treatments that took more out of her than she ever admitted out loud. You never call this early. Has anyone from the hospital reached out to you? About the account. A payment they couldn't explain. A pause on the line. Longer than Olivia liked. They mentioned something a while back. Yeah. I figured it was you. You've been weird about money stuff since the wedding. So I didn't push. It wasn't me, Grace. Then who? I don't know yet. Olivia watched a woman carry a fern out of the plant shop, oblivious to the conversation happening 10 feet away in a parked car. How long ago did they mention it? Couple years, maybe. I didn't think much of it. I was just glad the calls stopped. Grace's voice softened. Is everything okay? You sound weird. I'm figuring some things out, Olivia said. I'll tell you once I actually understand them myself. She hung up feeling worse than before she'd called. The timeline confirmed now from a second source. 2 years. Maybe a little more. Long before Daniel Hale had a face or a name in her life. She drove home with the radio off and the windows down. And by the time she got there, she'd made a decision she wasn't proud of and couldn't quite talk herself out of anyway. She went looking through Daniel's study while he was still at work. Not for anything specific, just for anything. And she found what she was looking for in the third drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of contracts she didn't understand and didn't try to. A folder, unlabeled, containing correspondence from the same law firm the Bushwick landlord had named, dated back further than she expected. Payment authorizations. A file for her sister's hospital account, opened 2 years and 3 months ago. A separate file, older still, referencing a foundation grant shortfall from 4 years back, the exact year her father died, the exact foundation her father had run. She sat on the floor of Daniel's study with the folder open in her lap for a long time before she heard his key in the front door. He found her there 20 minutes later, still sitting, the folder still open. And whatever he'd been about to say when he walked in died the moment he saw her face. "How long," she said, "have you been managing my life without telling me?" "Olivia, 2 years and 3 months for my sister's hospital account, 8 months for the gallery debt." And this she held up the oldest file, her hand not quite steady. "This is from 4 years ago, the year my father died, the year his foundation lost its funding." She looked up at him. "I didn't know you before we met in that lawyer's office, Daniel." "That's what you told me. That's what everyone told me. So explain to me why there's a file in your desk with my father's name on it dated years before either of us supposedly knew the other existed." He didn't answer right away, and in the silence that followed, something in his face gave way, the careful control cracking just enough for her to see, for one unguarded second. A man who'd been bracing for this exact conversation for a very long time, and had never found a version of it that didn't end with her looking at him the way she was looking at him now. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "Then tell me what it is." "I will." He took a step toward her, and stopped when she didn't move. "I promise you I will. Just not all of it tonight. Some of it isn't only mine to tell." "That's not an answer, Daniel." I know, his voice had gone rough at the edges, the most unpolished she'd ever heard it. "I know it's not. I need you to trust me for a few more days. Please. You've been paying for pieces of my life since before I knew your name," she said, standing now, the folder still clutched in one hand like evidence she couldn't bring herself to set down. "And you're asking me to trust you with the part you still haven't told me. Because the part I haven't told you isn't only about you," he said. And something in the way he said it made her stop halfway to the door. "It's about my family. What we did. What I found out we did. 2 years ago. Going through my grandfather's papers after he died. I didn't go looking for you because I felt sorry for you, Olivia. I went looking for you because I found out what our name did to your father's foundation, and I couldn't undo it. So I did the only thing I could think of instead." "Which was what?" "Marry me, pay off my debts like an apology you never had to say out loud." "I didn't plan the marriage," he said. "My grandmother did that part, for her own reasons, and I let her, because it put me somewhere I could actually help without you having to know why. I know how that sounds. I've known how it would sound for 2 years, and I still didn't find a way to say it that didn't risk exactly this." She stood very still, the folder heavy in her hand, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "I need air," she said, finally, and walked out before he could stop her. She didn't stop when he said her name behind her, and she didn't stop when her phone buzzed twice in her pocket with messages she didn't check until she was 3 blocks away, sitting on a bench in the cooling evening air, finally alone enough to read them. The first was from Daniel. "I should have told you a long time ago. I'm sorry. Please come home when you're ready. I'll explain everything I can." The second was from a number she didn't recognize, and it took her a moment to place it as the same number that had texted her about the hospital account outside the ballroom 5 days earlier. "You deserve to know the rest of it before he decides how much of it you're allowed to hear. Meet me tomorrow. I have the emails. RC." Olivia stared at the initials for a long moment before the name assembled itself in her head. Unwelcome and impossible, and, somehow, exactly the last person she would have chosen to hand her the truth. Ryan Cross agreed to meet her at a diner 2 neighborhoods away from anywhere either of them usually went, a place with vinyl booths and a coffee machine that had clearly seen better decades. And when Olivia slid into the seat across from him, she found a version of him she hadn't seen in 2 years of knowing him. He looked smaller somehow, less sure of the room. A man who'd spent a week discovering that the ground under his own feet wasn't as solid as he'd always assumed. "I know how this looks," he said, before she could say anything at all. "Believe me, I've had a week to think about how this looks. Start talking, Ryan. I'm not here for the apology tour." He slid his laptop across the table instead, already open to an inbox that wasn't his own name at the top. A compliance archive he had no real business having access to outside of business hours. 4 years ago, your father's foundation lost its primary funding line in a single fiscal quarter. I found the filing by accident, chasing something else. Something about Daniel's family and the size of their position in my fund. The decision traces back to Hale Group, specifically, to a board vote your husband's grandfather pushed through over a personal dispute that had nothing to do with your father's actual work. He turned the screen toward her. Eleanor Hale signed off on it. Her name's right there. Olivia read the email chain twice, her own hands steadier than she expected them to be, given how unsteady everything else in her chest had gone. Board minutes. A vote count. A dry bureaucratic paragraph that had, somewhere on the other side of it, taken her father's life's work and folded it into nothing within a single quarter. 4 years before a lawyer's office and a stranger with careful eyes and a tux that fit him too well. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked, without looking up. "Because I spent a week finding out I was a tool for that family too," Ryan said. And for once there was nothing performative in his voice at all. "Eleanor's people used me to rattle your husband at that party. I don't know what they were testing for, exactly, but I know I wasn't a person to them any more than you were. And I got tired of being the only one in this who didn't know the whole board was already in motion before I picked up a single piece." Olivia closed the laptop slowly, the diner's fluorescent light doing nothing to soften the sudden, sharp clarity of the last 5 days settling into a single shape. Daniel had told her the truth, or most of it. Eleanor's name sat right there in black and white, the origin point of everything that had happened to her father, to her sister, to the version of her own life she'd spent years believing she'd survived entirely on her own strength. What the email didn't tell her, and what she wouldn't understand until much later, was why Eleanor had signed that vote in the first place, and whether the woman who'd sat across from her by a fire 2 nights ago, hands trembling almost imperceptibly around a teacup, had been protecting something crueler than a personal grudge, or trying, however badly, to stop one. "Thank you," she told Ryan, and meant it more than she expected to. "I need to go." Olivia, he caught her arm gently as she stood, and let go the second she looked at him. "For what it's worth. I'm sorry. Not for the party. For before that. All of it." She didn't answer him. She walked out into the evening with her father's name still glowing on a stranger's laptop screen behind her. And somewhere in her purse, her phone had already started buzzing again. Daniel's name lighting up the screen for the 4th time in an hour. She didn't answer that either. Not yet. She walked for almost an hour before she let herself stop moving, ending up on a bench at the edge of a small park 2 blocks from an apartment that used to be hers before it was theirs. And she sat there long enough for the streetlights to come on, and the joggers to thin out, and a version of calm to settle over her that had less to do with feeling better and more to do with simply running out of the energy it took to keep being furious. She thought about her father the way she hadn't let herself think about him in longer than she wanted to admit. Not the diagnosis, not the hospital room, but the year before that, the year the Foundation's board meeting started running long, and he started coming home with his shoulders set in a way she hadn't understood at 11 years old and understood completely now. She thought about a version of history where a woman she'd met exactly once, by a fire, in a room built to keep her face half in shadow, had signed a piece of paper that took the ground out from under a man Olivia had loved more than she'd ever quite found the words for. She thought about Daniel, too, sitting somewhere in an apartment gone quiet without her in it, checking his phone every few minutes the way people check the weather when they already know a storm's coming, and there's nothing left to do but wait for it. She didn't feel sorry for him yet. She wasn't sure she was ready to. But somewhere underneath the anger, a smaller, steadier voice kept pointing out that he'd found this same truth 2 years ago and had spent every one of those months since quietly trying to undo damage he hadn't caused, instead of simply letting it sit, the way most people with that kind of name and that kind of money usually did. Across town, in the apartment she'd walked out of 3 hours earlier, Daniel sat at the kitchen counter with his phone face up in front of him, watching it not ring. The same way he'd watched it not ring for the better part of an hour. He'd called his grandmother once, briefly, and hung up before the call connected, because he didn't yet trust himself to say what he needed to say to her without saying several other things he'd regret by morning. He thought about the version of tonight where he'd told Olivia everything 8 months ago, in the lawyer's office, before either of them had signed anything, and knew the way he'd known for 2 years, that there had never been a version of that conversation where she agreed to marry a stranger on the strength of a confession about his family ruining her father. He'd told himself the timing would come later, once she trusted him enough to hear it without it costing them everything. He hadn't planned on the timing arriving anyway, uninvited. Delivered by the one man in the city he trusted least to deliver anything gently. Her key turned in the lock a little after 10. He didn't stand up. He didn't reach for her. He just waited, the way he'd been waiting all night, and let her decide how close she wanted to get. I know about the board vote, she said, from the doorway, still in her coat. Ryan showed me the filing. Your grandfather pushed it through. Your grandmother signed off. She watched his face carefully as she said it, looking for the flinch of a man caught by news instead of a man already living inside it. He didn't flinch. He just nodded, slow and tired. A man setting down a weight he'd been carrying alone for longer than either of them had been married. I know, he said. I've known for 2 years. I told you that part was true at least. Why didn't you tell me the rest of it in the study, instead of asking me to trust you for a few more days? Because the second I say my grandmother's name out loud in that sentence, this stops being a private thing between us and becomes a family war I can't fully control the shape of. He rubbed a hand over his face. I wanted one more day to figure out how to do this so it didn't blow up everything at once. I should have known better. I've known you 6 months longer than that plan ever needed to survive. She came and sat across from him at the counter. Not close, but not as far as she could have chosen either. I'm not finished being angry, Daniel. I want you to know that going in. I don't expect you to be. He met her eyes, steady despite everything the night had cost him. But I'd rather be angry with you across this counter than lied to across it. If that's the only version of tonight I get, I'll take it. They sat like that a while, not quite touching, not quite apart. The kind of silence two people share when they've both run out of things to say that would help and haven't yet found the things that would. Her phone buzzed once on the counter between them. Breaking it, a text from an unknown number again, though this time she recognized the area code before she even opened it. The same 3 digits as the law firm on the back of an old invoice in Bushwick. Mrs. Hale, this is outside counsel for the Hale family office. Mrs. Eleanor Hale requests you and Mr. Hale attend her at the earliest possible opportunity. She has become aware that certain confidential records may have left the firm's custody. She would like to discuss this directly and soon. Olivia set the phone down slowly and looked up at Daniel, and for the first time all night, something like fear moved through the room that had nothing to do with either of them. She knows, Olivia said, about Ryan, about the emails. Daniel was already reaching for his jacket. Then we're not waiting for morning. Eleanor's townhouse looked different at night with every light in the front rooms burning. None of the practiced dimness she usually kept for visitors. And Olivia understood before they'd even reached the door that whatever version of Eleanor Hale waited inside wouldn't be the one who'd poured tea with a steady hand and asked careful questions about a marriage. The car had barely stopped moving before Daniel was out of it, one hand already at the small of Olivia's back, guiding her up the steps 2 at a time in a way that told her more about how worried he actually was than anything he'd said in the car. The street was as quiet as it had been 2 nights earlier, the kind of quiet that money bought instead of earned. No traffic, no sirens, just the sound of their own footsteps on stone and, somewhere behind a hedge, a dog that didn't bother barking at people it had smelled 100 times before. The housekeeper let them in without a word and disappeared just as quietly. And Eleanor was already standing when they reached the sitting room, not seated in her chair by the fire this time, arms crossed. A woman who had clearly spent the last hour deciding exactly how this conversation would go and liking none of the available versions. Do you have any idea, Eleanor said, before either of them had fully crossed the threshold, what it cost this family when confidential board minutes leave the building in the hands of a disgraced fund manager? He's not the one who should worry you tonight, Daniel said. I am. You should both worry me. Eleanor's eyes moved to Olivia, sharp in a way they hadn't been by the fire 2 nights earlier. I assume you've seen the filing by now. I assume that's why we're standing here instead of sleeping. I've seen it, Olivia said. I know what you signed. I know what it did to my father. Do you? Eleanor's voice didn't rise, but something underneath it tightened, like a wire pulled to its final inch of give. You've seen 4 sentences in a board record, and you think you know what happened. Then tell me what I'm missing. Sit down, both of you. Eleanor gestured toward the chairs facing hers, and when neither of them moved, something flickered across her face. Irritation or fatigue. It was hard to tell which. Fine. Stand. I'll say it either way, and you'll hear it either way. And none of us needs to pretend this is a comfortable conversation. We're not here for comfortable, Daniel said. We're here because you summoned us at 11 at night over a leak. and I want to know exactly what you're protecting before I decide how much of it I'm willing to protect with you. I'm protecting this family's name, the same thing I've protected for 50 years, longer than either of you has been alive to appreciate what that actually requires. Eleanor's hands, folded in her lap, tightened once around each other. You think it's simple, don't you? Old woman signs a bad piece of paper, ruins a good man, spends the rest of her life pretending it didn't happen. That's the story you've built in your heads walking in here tonight. Then correct it, Olivia said. Because right now that's the only version anyone's given me. And I'd rather hear the true one from you than keep guessing at it from a stranger's filing cabinet. Eleanor was quiet a long moment, and when she spoke again, the anger had drained out of her voice, replaced by something older and more tired. A woman reaching for a version of events she'd clearly rehearsed alone for longer than tonight. My husband wanted your father's foundation, she said. Not for the arts funding, not for the education grants, for the endowment structure underneath it. A clean, well-regarded shell he intended to fold into a deal he was running that I only understood the shape of once it was almost too late to stop. He needed the foundation vulnerable to make it attractive to the partners he was courting. Desperate, in other words. Easy to absorb. She met Olivia's eyes directly. I pulled the hail position to make the foundation look like a bad investment to everyone else circling it. I thought I was cutting it loose before he could use it. I thought your father had enough runway to find other funding, once our name was off the books quietly enough that nobody asked why. That's not what happened, Olivia said, her voice flat, refusing the shape Eleanor was offering her. No, Eleanor agreed. It wasn't. He found other funding lines faster than I expected he'd need to, which told me later he was already in worse shape than I understood. And cutting him loose the way I did closed doors, I didn't know were the last ones open to him. I found that out after the fact. By then he was gone within the year. And there was no version of an apology that would have meant anything to a dead man. Her jaw tightened. I have lived with that math for 4 years, Mrs. Hale. Longer than you've known my grandson's name. For a moment, something in Olivia wavered, the story landing with just enough logic, just enough grief in it, to make her want to soften. She could see the shape of a woman who had made one calculation to prevent a worse one, and lost the gamble in a way that had genuinely cost her sleep. It would have been easy. Standing there, to let the explanation close the wound. You could have called him, Olivia said instead. The year it happened, or the year after. You could have picked up a phone once and told him what you tried to stop and what it cost him instead. You didn't. You let a family you'd hurt disappear into a footnote, and you only started doing anything about it once your own grandson found the paper trail and made you deal with it. Her voice didn't shake. That's not a woman who made one hard call in an impossible situation. That's a woman who decided the guilt was easier to carry in private than the conversation would have been in public. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Olivia had met her, she didn't have an answer ready. She's right, Daniel said quietly, and Eleanor's eyes cut to him, something wounded flashing behind them before the control came back down like a shutter. You had 4 years. Grandmother, I found out about this by accident, going through grandfather's picture after he died, and I spent 2 years quietly trying to fix what I could without ever once hearing you say his name out loud unprompted. If you'd wanted to make it right, you had the resources and the time. What you actually did was let me marry into the family I damaged so the fixing could happen at arm's length, where it wouldn't touch your name at all. That's not fair, Eleanor said, but the words came out smaller than the ones she usually used, less armored. It's exactly fair, Daniel said, and I let it happen too, because it was easier than the alternative. So I'm not standing here innocent either. I'm standing here telling you both versions of this end tonight, the quiet one and the private one. Eleanor sat down slowly, the fight going out of her all at once, the way it does in people who've been holding a shape upright for far longer than their body wanted to. And what does that look like? Exactly, the two of you deciding my history for me. It looks like the William Bennett Foundation getting refunded, publicly, under its own name, with Hale Group's involvement disclosed instead of buried, Daniel said. It looks like you writing a real letter to Olivia's mother's grave, if that's the only version of an apology left to give. And it looks like you dropping whatever legal threat your lawyers drafted tonight against Ryan Cross. Because a man trying to undo a wrong he stumbled into isn't the villain in this house. Ryan Cross stole confidential records. Ryan Cross found records your own husband should never have let exist in the first place, Daniel said. Pursue him legally. And I promise you every filing becomes public in discovery. Every board minute. Every name. You'll lose the quiet you've spent 4 years protecting. And you'll lose it in a courtroom instead of a sitting room. On someone else's timeline instead of your own. Eleanor looked between them for a long moment. And something crossed her face that Olivia hadn't seen there before. Not quite defeat, but the particular exhaustion of a woman realizing the version of control she'd spent 70 years perfecting had finally run out of places left to hide. I built this family out of decisions no one else was willing to make, Eleanor said, mostly to herself. I don't know how to be the version of myself you're both asking for. You don't have to know yet, Daniel said. You just have to stop making the same one again. She didn't answer that. She reached instead for the bell pull beside her chair, summoned the housekeeper, and asked, in a voice gone thin at the edges, for the folder from her desk, the one with outside counsel's letterhead on it. When it came, she held it a moment, then set it down on the low table between them without opening it. I'll drop the matter with cross capitals, man, she said. The rest, I need time to think through in a way that isn't tonight, in this room, with both of you standing over me like a tribunal. She looked up, and for a second the old sharpness returned, thin and worn but not entirely gone. Don't mistake tonight for forgiveness of yourself either, Olivia. You married into money you needed. That part happened whatever else turns out to be true underneath it. I'd sit with that honestly, if I were you, instead of only sitting with what I owe you. It landed exactly the way Eleanor meant it to, a small blade tucked into an otherwise retreating hand, and Olivia found she didn't have anything ready to throw back at it. Not tonight. Not with everything else in the room already spent. They left without saying much else. In the car, Daniel reached for her hand, and this time she let him hold it the entire ride home, though neither of them said a word until they were standing in their own kitchen, the counter between them empty for once of unread messages and unanswered calls. She's not wrong, Olivia said finally. About the money. I did need it. You needed it because my family made sure you would, Daniel's toe said. That's the part she left out. He turned to face her fully. I've spent 2 years telling myself that fixing the money fixed the wrong. It doesn't. I know that now. I think I've known it for a while and didn't want to look at it too closely. Because looking at it meant admitting the marriage started as guilt wearing a nicer coat. Did it? It started as guilt, he said. It didn't stay that. Somewhere in the last 8 months, it turned into something I'd have chosen even if the guilt had never existed at all. I need you to believe that. But I'm not going to ask you to just because I said it out loud once in a kitchen at midnight. Then how do I believe it? You watch what I do next, he said. Starting tomorrow. Tomorrow turned out to be harder than either of them expected. 2 days after the meeting at the townhouse, a gossip column ran 3 paragraphs about the Hale marriage under a headline that made Olivia's stomach drop before she'd even finished the first sentence. Something about a foundation scandal and a wife with a conveniently timed debt history. Sourced, the column claimed, from someone close to the family. Daniel spent that morning on the phone with 3 different lawyers, none of whom worked for his grandmother, trying to trace where the leak had actually come from. And by afternoon it was clear enough without needing full proof. Nobody else had the specific numbers. Nobody else knew the gallery balance down to the dollar. She's not fighting fair, Olivia said, reading the column a second time at the kitchen counter, her voice tighter than she wanted it to be. She's scared, Daniel said. Scared people don't fight fair. They fight fast, before they lose the chance to fight at all. He set his phone down. This is the part where it would be easier to let her write the story her way. Quiet it down. Deny the worst of it. Let the rest fade in a news cycle. Is that what you're going to do? No, he looked at her. And something in his face had gone harder than she'd seen it since the ballroom. It's what I would have done a year ago. It's not what I'm doing now. 2 board members Olivia had never met called Daniel directly that same week to remind him, in careful corporate language, that airing family business in public tended to spook the very investors his grandmother had spent decades cultivating, and that whatever he thought he owed a dead man's daughter, he owed the company something too. He listened to both calls without interrupting, and told Olivia afterward that neither of them had said anything he hadn't already said to himself at 3 in the morning, at least once that week. So what changes your mind? She asked. If you've already had the doubt. Nothing changes my mind, he said. The doubt doesn't mean I'm wrong. It just means I know what it's going to cost. Going in instead of finding out after. What he did next took most of a week, and none of it involved a single check written quietly through a law firm 3 names long. The interview happened on a Tuesday afternoon. In an office Daniel chose specifically because it wasn't the Hale Group building. A small conference room with bad lighting, and a reporter who'd covered finance long enough to know when someone was telling her something they didn't have to. Olivia watched most of it from a chair just out of frame, close enough to see Daniel's hands, which stayed still and open on the table the entire time. None of the careful stillness he usually wore like armor. Your family pulled funding from a foundation that later collapsed, the reporter said, reading from her notes. 4 years ago. You're telling me that on the record. I am. And you married the daughter of the man who ran it. I did. Daniel didn't look away from her. I'd like to be careful here, because I know how that sentence sounds on its own. I found out about the funding decision 2 years into looking for a way to make it right, not the other way around. I'm not asking anyone to believe the marriage started as something uncomplicated. I'm telling you it didn't stay what it started as. And I'd rather say that plainly than have someone else say it for me. Badly, later. Your grandmother signed off on the original vote. She did. She's read this before it ran. I didn't ask her permission, and she didn't ask me to change anything. He paused. This isn't a story about punishing her. It's a story about a foundation getting its name and its funding back, publicly, so nobody has to take my family's word for it that we've fixed anything. You can go check. That's the whole point of doing it this way. The piece ran 3 days later, shorter than Olivia expected, more measured than the tabloid column that had run the week before, and it did what Daniel said it would. People checked. The foundation's new board, entirely outside the family, confirmed the funding. The trustees. The plaque going back up with William Bennett's name, spelled correctly this time, after the printer had gotten it wrong once. Decades ago, in a program nobody but Olivia's mother had ever kept a copy of. Olivia read the article twice at the kitchen counter, the same counter where she'd once read a text about a hospital account she hadn't authorized, and found that this time nothing in her chest dropped at all. You didn't have to say the part about it starting as guilt. She told him that night. You could have left that out. Nobody would have known. I would have known. He sat down across from her. I spent 2 years letting the money speak for me instead of saying anything myself. I'm not doing that again. Not even when the truth makes me look worse than the version I could have controlled. The board grumbled loudest of anyone in the days after it ran, exactly as the 2 directors had warned him it would. Though by then Daniel had already stopped waiting for their permission to do the right thing slowly enough to keep everyone comfortable. He stepped back from the seat on Hale Group's board his grandmother had been grooming him for since he was 22, publicly, and handed the family's foundation work to a board of outside trustees with no family members on it at all. William Bennett's name restored to the letterhead of an organization Daniel funded but no longer controlled. It cost him more than any check he'd ever signed. A piece of the inheritance his family had spent 3 generations building towards specifically for him, and he didn't take it back when Eleanor, 3 days later, called to tell him he was making a mistake he'd regret. Maybe, Daniel told her, standing in his own kitchen with the phone on speaker so Olivia could hear it too. But it's mine to make now. That's the whole point. Olivia drove out to see Grace the following weekend, the first visit in months where she didn't spend the whole ride rehearsing what to leave out. She told her sister everything. The board vote, the foundation, the 2 years of quiet payments. Watching Grace's face move through disbelief and then something quieter, closer to relief, as the pieces finally lined up into a shape that made sense. So the account, Grace said slowly, sitting up straighter against the pillows. It's actually done. Nobody's going to call again asking who authorized what. It's done. Daniel's handling the last of it properly now, through the new foundation, not through some anonymous law firm. Olivia reached over and took her sister's hand. And once it's fully sorted, I want to take over what's left myself. My name on it. My payments. I don't want to owe a stranger's guilt for the rest of my life just because it happened to show up shaped like help. Grace studied her for a long moment. That's going to take you a lot longer than letting the guilt keep paying for it. I know Olivia squeezed her hand. I'd still rather it be slow in mine than fast in somebody else's. Grace laughed. The first real laugh Olivia had heard out of her in weeks, and it did more to loosen the knot in Olivia's chest than any part of the last 10 days had managed on its own. Ryan Cross never went back to Cross Capital. Marcus offered him a version of reinstatement once the Hale legal threat quietly disappeared. A demotion dressed up as a fresh start over coffee in a conference room that used to feel like his. And Ryan sat across from the same desk, where he'd once been told he was on leave, and found he didn't want any part of what was being offered back to him. It's a good deal. All things considered, Marcus said. Smaller book, but you keep your title. Most guys in your position would take it without blinking. I know it's a good deal. Ryan turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, not drinking it. I keep thinking about how fast I said yes to the last thing somebody handed me and told me was a good deal. Look how that went. He turned it down in a two-line email that surprised even him when he read it back, and took a job instead at a smaller firm across town. Less money, less name recognition, the kind of place that didn't come with a corner office or a company that needed protecting from what he'd seen. The first week there, a junior analyst asked him why he'd left Cross Capital, and Ryan gave an answer shorter and truer than anything he'd said out loud in 2 years. He said he'd finally gotten tired of being handed things. He didn't call Olivia again after the diner. He didn't need to. The last thing he said to her, that he was sorry for more than the party, had been the truest sentence he'd managed in 2 years. And some sentences only need saying once to mean what they're supposed to. Months later, a small paragraph ran in the same gossip column that had once printed the tabloid piece about Olivia's debts. This time about Ryan Cross quietly making partner at a firm nobody in his old circles had heard of. He didn't send it to anyone. He just kept the clipping in a drawer. The way people keep the first proof that a harder version of themselves actually held. He ran into Victoria at a different event. Months later, a smaller gathering nobody would call a gala. And when she offered him a drink and a conversation the way she always used to, low and warm and full of a promise she never quite spelled out, he said no to both, politely, and meant it in a way he hadn't managed to mean much of anything in longer than he wanted to admit. Olivia went back to the plant shop that used to be her gallery exactly once, not to reclaim it, since the lease had long since moved on to someone who deserved the space more than her old grief did, but to stand in the doorway and let herself feel the shape of what she'd lost without needing it fixed by anyone, least of all a husband with a law firm on retainer. She found a smaller space 2 months later, on her own, using her own savings and a loan she qualified for on her own name and her own credit. No anonymous accounts, no cashier's checks from lawyers she'd never met. Daniel helped her carry boxes on moving day and said nothing about money the entire afternoon, which was, she realized, exactly the gift she'd needed from him all along. He did offer, once, to have someone come paint the walls before she moved her work in, and backed off the second she looked at him, laughing despite herself, and told him she'd already picked the color and intended to hold the brush herself. Old habits, he said, holding his hands up. New rules, she said, and handed him a roller instead of a checkbook. The opening happened on a Thursday evening in early autumn, small and unglamorous. String lights instead of chandeliers, folding tables instead of a quartet. Wine in plastic cups because the good glasses hadn't arrived yet. Ryan didn't come, though he sent flowers with no card attached, which she chose to read as its own kind of ending. Eleanor didn't come either, though a letter arrived the following week. Handwritten, 3 pages long, addressed to Olivia's mother by name, a copy of which Olivia never opened past the first line, because some doors, once offered, didn't need to be walked through to be believed. Daniel came, of course, standing near the back the way he always did at things that weren't about him, watching her move through a room full of her own work, with the particular pride of a man who'd finally learned the difference between rescuing someone and simply showing up. He didn't introduce himself to anyone as her husband. He let people find that out on their own, the same way he'd let her find out, slowly and on her own terms, exactly what kind of man he was underneath the name. A woman Olivia didn't recognize stopped in front of one of the larger canvases near the register, a wide, unfinished-looking piece Olivia had almost left out of the show entirely, and stood there long enough that Olivia eventually walked over. This one, the woman said, without looking away from it. What's it called? Olivia glanced at the canvas, the layers of color she'd built up and scraped back down over months without ever quite deciding it was finished, and found the title arriving easily, the way the true ones always did once she stopped trying so hard to invent something clever. 11 months, she said. The woman bought it before she left. You didn't have to come tonight, she told Daniel later, once the last guests had gone and they were alone among the paintings, the string lights still glowing warm against the brick. I know, he said, echoing a night 8 months earlier that felt, now, like it belonged to 2 different people entirely. Doesn't mean I didn't want to. She smiled and reached for his hand, and for the first time since a party at the Ashford had cracked open everything she thought she knew about her own marriage. The silence between them held nothing hidden in it at all. Outside, the city kept doing what it always did, indifferent to the particular shape of any one night, Any one family, any one quiet reckoning finally settling into place behind a set of borrowed string lights. Somewhere across town, Eleanor Hale sat by her own fire, alone, the house too quiet now the way it always was, once she'd stopped needing an audience for anything. Somewhere farther still, Ryan Cross was closing out another ordinary week at a desk with a smaller name on the door than he used to answer to, and finding, most days now, that it fit him better than the last one ever had. None of it was finished. None of it would ever be entirely finished. The way old debts rarely close all the way, no matter how carefully the last payment gets made. But for the length of one evening, in one small room full of unglamorous folding tables and work that belonged entirely to her, Olivia stood beside the one person who'd finally told her the whole truth instead of managing her around it, and found that was enough to build the rest of it on.